My mama used to tell me that gospel music could save a dying soul. The terrifying part was realizing she might have been right. 3rd April 1971. Nashville Municipal Auditorium. 8,000 people packed into a building never meant to hold that many bodies. The air was thick with sweat, cigarette smoke, perfume, television heat, and something else no one could explain yet. Tension. The kind that presses against your ribs before disaster or revelation. Nobody in that audience knew they were about to witness two legends crack open in front of the entire country. And nobody, not even Johnny Cash, understood the danger of the dare he was about to make. Backstage, Elvis Presley stood alone in front of a mirror, staring at a face he barely recognized anymore. The black suit fit perfectly. The sunglasses hid the exhaustion, but nothing could hide the tremor in his hands. He hadn't slept properly in days. Vegas was killing him slowly. 2 shows a night, pills to wake up, pills to come down, smiles for strangers, handshakes for businessmen, cameras every second, every person wanting a piece of Elvis Presley while nobody asked what remained underneath. He leaned closer to the mirror. For one horrible second, he saw his mother. Not clearly, just a memory. Her tired eyes, her soft voice humming old church hymns while washing dishes in Tupelo. The sound hit him so suddenly that his chest tightened. He looked away immediately. He couldn't do this tonight. Not gospel. Anything but gospel. A knock came at the dressing room door. 5 minutes, Mr. Presley. Elvis nodded silently. The moment the assistant left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver cross. His mother had given it to him years before she died. He rubbed it with his thumb like a nervous habit. Then he whispered something almost nobody ever heard from him anymore. "Help me through tonight, Mama." Outside, the auditorium exploded with applause as Johnny Cash walked onto the stage beside June Carter and the Statler brothers. The lights burned hot against his face, but Johnny barely noticed. He was focused on the 3rd row, on Elvis. Johnny had known pain his entire life. Addiction, shame, self-destruction, nights so dark he thought God himself had abandoned him. But when he looked at Elvis Presley that night, he saw something even worse. A man disappearing inside. His own legend. Elvis smiled for the cameras, but Johnny saw beyond it. Saw the deadness behind the glasses. Saw the loneliness. Saw the exhaustion sitting on his shoulders like chains. And suddenly, Johnny couldn't ignore it anymore. The performance ended. Applause thundered through the building. Johnny was supposed to leave the stage. He didn't. Instead, he slowly stepped back toward the microphone. The audience quieted. June looked at him carefully. She knew that expression. Johnny was about to do something dangerous. "You know," Johnny said softly, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "There's somebody here tonight who changed music forever." The crowd cheered immediately. Johnny kept his eyes fixed on Elvis, but before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before Hollywood and Vegas and all the noise, he paused. He was just a boy singing gospel music in church beside his mama. The audience turned toward Elvis instantly. Elvis froze. A pulse of panic hit his stomach. "No. Johnny, don't do this." "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny continued, "Elvis Presley." The crowd erupted. Cameras swung toward Elvis. Huge screens lit up with his face. He smiled automatically. The trained smile, the celebrity smile. But under the table, His fingers dug into his knees. Johnny stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "And I think it's a tragedy," he said, "that the world forgot what that man's voice sounds like when he sings for God instead of money." The room shifted. People leaned forward. Something electric moved through the air. Elvis lowered his head slightly. His heartbeat was accelerating now. Colonel Parker stiffened nearby. This wasn't planned. Johnny looked directly at Elvis. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Elvis," Johnny said quietly, "I dare you." The auditorium went dead silent. "I dare you to come up here tonight and sing gospel the way you used to sing it before the world got hold of you." Elvis felt the blood drain from his face. Johnny kept going. "I dare you to sing like that little boy from Tupelo again." Still silence. Then Johnny delivered the final blow. "I dare you to sing for your mama." Elvis stopped breathing. The mention of Gladys Presley shattered something inside him instantly. Not his mother. God, not her. For 13 years, he had avoided that pain like fire. Every gospel song reminded him of her funeral, of the hospital room, of the guilt that ate him alive because fame had taken him away from her during the years she needed him most. And now Johnny had dragged that grief into the middle of a packed arena. Elvis looked down at the floor. Part of him wanted to leave. Another part wanted to scream at Johnny for humiliating him. But deeper than both, something hurt. Something old. Something buried. The audience waited breathlessly. Millions watched from home. Johnny said nothing more. He simply stood there waiting like a man holding open a door. And slowly Elvis stood up. The entire auditorium gasped. Not applause. Shock. Real shock. Because suddenly this no longer felt like entertainment. It felt personal. Elvis stepped into the aisle. Every eye followed him. Camera flashes exploded around him like lightning. His legs felt heavy. Each step toward the stage felt like walking toward a grave he'd spent 13 years trying not to visit. When he reached the stairs, Johnny extended his hand. Elvis stared at it for a second, then grabbed it. Johnny leaned close enough that nobody else could hear. "You don't got to be Elvis tonight," he whispered. "Just be honest." The words cut deeper than Johnny realized. Elvis walked to center stage slowly. The crowd was so quiet you could hear shoes scraping against the floor. The band prepared themselves. Elvis raised a hand. No instruments. The musicians froze. Elvis swallowed hard and stepped toward the microphone. "If I do this," he said softly, "I got to do it the way Mama taught me." No lights moved. No applause came. The entire building felt suspended in time. Elvis closed his eyes. And suddenly he wasn't 36 years old anymore. He was 8. Tiny church in Tupelo. Wooden pews. Summer heat. His mother beside him singing so softly it felt like prayer itself. For a moment he almost couldn't continue. Then he opened his mouth. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. His voice cracked immediately. A sharp, ugly crack, not polished, not controlled. Real. The audience felt it instantly. This wasn't Elvis Presley performing. This was a wounded son trying not to collapse in front of strangers. He pushed through the next line. "That saved a wretch like me." His breathing trembled. His hands shook at his sides. And suddenly every ounce of pain he'd hidden behind fame began leaking into the music. People in the audience started crying before the first verse even ended, because they could hear it. The grief, the loneliness, the guilt. 13 years of sorrow buried under gold records and screaming fans. Johnny Cash stood near the side of the stage watching silently. Then tears filled his eyes, fat, violently. Because he realized this was no longer a performance. It was confession. Elvis kept singing. His voice breaking, recovering, breaking again. Every lyric sounded ripped directly from his chest. The cameras zoomed closer. Television viewers across America stared in stunned silence as the biggest entertainer in the world slowly stopped pretending to be strong. And somewhere during the second verse something changed. Elvis' voice deepened. Strength entered it. Not polished strength, not Vegas perfection. Something rawer. Like a man surviving his own collapse in real time. Johnny wiped tears from his face, but they kept coming harder. June Carter watched him carefully from backstage. She'd seen Johnny emotional before. Never like this. Johnny suddenly looked terrified. Because Elvis wasn't the only one unraveling. The song was tearing Johnny open, too. And before he realized what he was doing, Johnny Cash walked back toward the microphone. Johnny Cash stepped toward the microphone like a man being pulled by something stronger than himself. Elvis was still singing, eyes closed, voice trembling. Amazing grace, how precious did that grace appear? And suddenly Johnny understood something terrifying. Elvis Presley wasn't performing anymore. He was surviving. Johnny stopped beside him slowly. Tears streamed openly down his face now. He didn't even try to hide them. The audience watched in complete silence as the man in black looked less like a legend and more like a broken brother trying to hold himself together. Then Johnny lowered his head and quietly joined the harmony. The sound that hit the auditorium next felt almost unreal. Elvis' wounded tenor, Johnny's deep trembling bass. One voice sounded like grief. The other sounded like exhaustion. Together, they sounded like confession. A woman near the front row covered her mouth and started sobbing, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire atmosphere inside the auditorium changed. It no longer felt like a concert hall. It felt like church, real church, the kind where people came carrying invisible wounds they were too ashamed to speak out loud. The television crew stopped whispering. Camera operators wiped tears from their faces while still filming. Even security guards stood frozen. Nobody wanted to breathe too loudly and break whatever was happening on that stage. Elvis continued singing, but now his voice carried something new. Freedom. Pain was still there, deep, violent, but for the first time in years, he wasn't hiding from it. And the audience could feel that honesty hitting them like a wave. Because every person in that building had lost something. A mother, a marriage, faith, sobriety, hope. And suddenly Elvis Presley wasn't the king. He was every broken human being trying to survive their own darkness. Johnny looked at him while they sang together, and memories slammed into him without warning. Pills, hotel rooms, blood on sinks, nights June cried herself to sleep because she thought he was dying. The cave in Tennessee where he'd gone to disappear forever. Johnny felt shame twisting inside his chest. Because he remembered something most people didn't know. A year earlier he'd nearly destroyed himself again. And now here stood Elvis, another man drowning under fame, expectation, loneliness. And Johnny realized he had challenged Elvis tonight because deep down he was trying to save himself, too. The harmony deepened. The room grew stiller. Then Elvis reached the line, "I once was lost." His voice cracked so hard the sentence nearly collapsed. Johnny immediately looked at him. Elvis tried again. "I once was lost." This time the words came out broken. Not sung. Broken. And suddenly Elvis opened his eyes. Tears filled them completely. Millions watching on television had never seen this before. Not from him. Elvis Presley had spent his entire career controlling the image, controlling the smile, controlling the mystery. But now there was no control left. Only truth. Johnny saw Elvis trying not to fall apart and instinctively stepped closer, their shoulders nearly touching. Then Elvis sang the final words directly toward Johnny. "But now and found." The line hit Johnny like a bullet. His face collapsed instantly. A sound escaped him. A small wounded sound. And he turned away from the microphone because he couldn't stop crying anymore. June Carter covered her mouth backstage. She had seen her husband battle addiction. Seen him violent with himself. Seen him ashamed. Seen him pray through tears at 3 o'clock in the morning. But she had never seen him break like this. Johnny tried to recover. But the harder he fought it, the worse it became. His shoulders started shaking. The audience noticed immediately. And suddenly the entire auditorium felt emotionally unstable. As if thousands of people were barely holding themselves together at once. Elvis looked at Johnny. Really looked at him. And for the first time all night, Elvis stopped thinking about himself. Because now he recognized the pain in Johnny too. Two giants. Two famous men. Both exhausted. Both hiding damage. Both terrified of their own emptiness. The final verse began. No instruments. No production. Just two shattered voices trying to reach something holy before it disappeared again. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. The audience stood slowly. Not applause. Nobody dared interrupt. People simply rose to their feet one by one like they were attending a funeral and a resurrection at the same time. An elderly man in the balcony removed his hat and held it against his chest. A young woman clutched her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Several television crew members were openly crying now. And backstage, Colonel Tom Parker looked furious. Because this wasn't marketable. This wasn't controlled. This was dangerous. Elvis Presley was exposing himself emotionally in front of the world. And Parker hated unpredictability more than anything. But for once, Elvis didn't care. The song reached its end. Silence swallowed the building. Complete silence. No applause. No movement. Just thousands of people staring at the stage in disbelief. Johnny's breathing became uneven. His chest rose sharply. He looked like a man trying not to collapse completely. Then suddenly, Elvis stepped forward and pulled Johnny into his arms. The entire audience froze. Johnny broke instantly. Not polite tears. Not movie tears. Real sobbing. The kind that comes from somewhere buried for years. His knees nearly buckled. Elvis, Johnny whispered weakly. Barely audible through the microphone. "Thank you." Elvis held him tighter. And then Johnny said the sentence nobody expected. "You saved my life tonight." The auditorium erupted emotionally. People cried openly now. Some covered their faces. Others simply stared in stunned silence because they knew they were witnessing something real. Something too raw to be performed. Elvis closed his eyes while holding Johnny upright. "No," Elvis whispered back. "You reminded me who I was." Johnny buried his face against Elvis' shoulder, shaking violently. And suddenly, June Carter walked onto the stage. Slowly, carefully, like someone entering sacred ground. The cameras followed her immediately. She reached Johnny first and gently touched his back. The moment he felt her hand, Johnny completely lost control. He turned and collapsed into June's arms. The audience cried even harder seeing it. Because June didn't look embarrassed, didn't try to stop him, didn't pull him together. She simply held him like she'd done 1,000 times before. Elvis watched silently, emotion flooding his face. And something inside him shifted painfully. Because he realized how alone he had become. He had fame, money, women, crowds. But standing there watching June hold Johnny together, Elvis realized he hadn't truly let anybody hold his pain in years. Not since his mother died. That realization hit him harder than the song itself. For a second, he looked completely lost. June looked toward Elvis gently. Not as a superstar, as a hurting man. And that almost broke him again. The applause finally began. Slow, soft, almost reverent. Nobody screamed. Nobody whistled. The crowd applauded the way people applaud a church after a testimony. Carefully, emotionally, like they knew something sacred had happened and didn't want to damage it. Johnny finally lifted his head from June's shoulder. His eyes were swollen red. Elvis stepped toward the microphone again slowly. The entire building quieted instantly. He swallowed hard. When he spoke, his voice sounded completely different now. Smaller, human. "My mama," he began softly, then paused because emotion caught his throat again. He looked down briefly before continuing. "My mama used to tell me that a man can have the whole world," he exhaled shakily, "and still lose his soul if he forgets where he came from." Nobody moved. Elvis looked toward Johnny. "Tonight, this man reminded me." Tears rolled down his face again. "But what scares me," Elvis whispered, "is I think I needed reminding more than I wanted to admit." The confession hit the audience like another wave because now Elvis Presley, the untouchable icon, was standing exposed under bright television lights admitting he was lost. And somehow that honesty made him greater than ever before. Johnny stepped beside him again, still emotional. Elvis placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder. Then he looked across the sea of people. "What happened here tonight," Elvis said quietly, "wasn't music." He paused. It was survival. Silence. Deep silence. Then, suddenly, from somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a woman shouted through tears, "Sing another one." The audience laughed emotionally through crying. But Elvis smiled sadly. And for the first time that night, the smile looked real. The applause faded slowly, but the feeling inside the auditorium didn't. Nobody sat down. Nobody wanted to break the moment. It felt like if anyone moved too suddenly, whatever had just happened on that stage would disappear forever. Elvis stood under the burning television lights breathing heavily, sweat mixing with tears on his face. His chest still hurt, but not in the same way. For 13 years, grief had lived inside him like a locked room. Tonight, Johnny Cash had kicked the door open. And now Elvis didn't know whether to thank him for it or hate him. The audience kept staring at the stage like people waking from a dream. Johnny wiped his eyes slowly. Still standing beside Elvis, June Carter held Johnny's hand tightly, grounding him before he drifted too far into the emotional storm still tearing through him. Then Elvis leaned toward the microphone one final time. "You want to know the truth?" he asked quietly. The room became perfectly silent again. Elvis looked out across the crowd, but somehow it felt like he was speaking to himself. "I spent years thinking success would heal everything." A painful smile crossed his face. "It don't." Not a single sound came from the audience. "You can fill rooms with screaming people," Elvis continued. "You can sell millions of records, buy houses, cars, jewelry." His voice weakened slightly. "But when the lights go out and you are alone with yourself," he paused, "none of it can hold you together." Several people in the audience lowered their heads crying. Because now he wasn't talking like a celebrity anymore. He sounded like every exhausted person hiding behind a fake smile. Elvis glanced toward Johnny again. "But tonight," he whispered, "for the first time in a long time, I felt something real." Johnny's eyes filled immediately. Elvis swallowed hard before continuing. "And that scared me." That line hit the room harder than anything else. Because everybody understood exactly what he meant. Real healing is terrifying. Real honesty is terrifying. Especially for people who spent their whole lives hiding pain behind performance. Johnny slowly stepped closer again. "Elvis," he said softly, voice still shaking. "You ain't alone in that." Elvis looked at him. And suddenly both men started laughing quietly through tears. Not because anything was funny. Because they were overwhelmed. The audience laughed emotionally with them. Relief finally entered the building. But underneath it, the sadness remained. Heavy. Sacred. Alive. Backstage after the broadcast ended, the energy shifted completely. Managers argued, producers panicked. Television executives whispered furiously about the footage. Colonel Tom Parker stormed through the corridors red-faced with anger. "What the hell was that?" he snapped at Elvis the moment he entered the backstage hallway. Elvis didn't answer immediately. He looked drained, emotionally hollowed out. Parker pointed toward the stage violently. "You don't do that on live television. You don't break down in front of people. You're Elvis Presley." That sentence hung in the air. "You're Elvis Presley." For years Elvis had heard those words like chains around his neck. Act like Elvis, smile like Elvis, perform like Elvis, never crack. Never bleed. Never let them see the human being underneath. But tonight they had seen him. And strangely he felt lighter because of it. Elvis looked directly at Parker. "No," he said quietly. "Tonight I was just Elvis." Parker stared at him speechless. Because for the first time in years Elvis Presley sounded completely serious about something that had nothing to do with fame. Johnny watched the exchange silently from nearby. Then he stepped forward. "That performance mattered," Johnny said firmly. Parker scoffed. "It was messy." Johnny's eyes hardened instantly. "Exactly." Silence. Johnny moved closer. "People don't need another polished lie," he said. I got enough of those already. Parker shook his head in disgust and walked away muttering under his breath about damage control. The hallway finally quieted. Then Elvis suddenly looked exhausted beyond words. Johnny noticed immediately. You all right? Elvis leaned against the wall slowly. I don't know. And for some reason that honesty hit Johnny harder than anything else. Because powerful men almost never admit they're lost. They pretend. They hide. They self-destruct quietly. But Elvis looked completely stripped down now. Like the performance had torn away every layer protecting him. June Carter approached gently. You boys need a minute, she said softly. Johnny nodded. June touched Elvis' arm kindly before walking away to give them privacy. The dressing room door closed behind them. Finally, silence. Real silence. No cameras. No audience. No expectations. Just two exhausted men sitting across from each other. For several minutes neither spoke. Johnny lit a cigarette with shaky fingers. Elvis stared at the floor. Then finally, you know what the worst part is? Elvis asked quietly. Johnny looked up. Elvis rubbed his hands together nervously. I think I forgot who I was. The confession sat heavily between them. Johnny exhaled smoke slowly. That happens. Elvis shook his head. No, I mean really forgot. His voice cracked again. I became whatever everybody needed me to be. Silence. The king. Another silence. The sex symbol. Another. The movie star. Elvis finally looked at Johnny, eyes exhausted beyond description. But somewhere in all that, he whispered, that little church boy disappeared. Johnny felt chills crawl across his arms because he understood perfectly. He had fought the same battle himself. The world turns people into symbols, machines, products, legends. And eventually, the real human underneath starts suffocating. Johnny leaned forward slowly. You know why tonight mattered? Elvis looked at him tiredly. Because for 3 minutes, Johnny said, you stopped performing. The room went silent again. Then Elvis did something almost nobody ever saw him do. He cried quietly. Not dramatic sobbing, not collapse. Just silent tears falling while he stared at the floor like a man mourning himself. Johnny didn't interrupt, didn't offer fake comfort. He simply sat there with him, brother to brother, human to human. After a while, Elvis finally spoke again. Mama would have liked tonight. Johnny smiled sadly. She was there. Elvis looked up slowly. Johnny tapped his chest gently. Right there. That completely shattered Elvis again. He covered his face with one hand trying to regain control, but the tears kept coming harder now. Years of pressure, years of loneliness, years of pretending, all finally escaping. And Johnny realized something heartbreaking in that moment. Elvis Presley wasn't dying from fame. He was dying from emotional isolation. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then Johnny suddenly remembered something. You know they recorded all of it. Elvis slowly lowered his hand. The cameras? Johnny nodded. Every second. Elvis leaned back heavily. A strange fear entered his expression. Because now he realized the world might someday see him like this. Broken, vulnerable, human. I can't let that get out, Elvis whispered. Johnny frowned slightly. Why? Elvis laughed weakly through tears. Because people don't want truth. Johnny. He shook his head. They want Elvis Presley. Johnny stared at him carefully. Then he said something neither man forgot for the rest of their lives. Maybe that's exactly why they need to see it. The sentence hung in the air like scripture. Elvis looked away silently. Deep down, he knew Johnny was right. But truth terrified him. Finally, Johnny stood up and extended his hand. Then we lock it away. Elvis looked confused. Johnny continued, we keep it safe until the world's ready for it. Elvis stared at him, and if the world's never ready? Johnny gave a tired smile. Then maybe it'll matter more after we're gone. Slowly, Elvis stood up. The two men shook hands quietly. No cameras, no audience. Just an agreement between two broken souls who understood each other better than almost anyone else ever had. That night, the master tapes were locked away, officially archived, buried. Almost nobody allowed to view them. But rumors spread for decades. People whispered about the night Elvis Presley stopped being a legend and became human again. Some claimed audience members cried for hours afterward. Others swore hardened stage crew members knelt backstage praying after the performance ended. Bootleg copies circulated secretly between collectors like forbidden relics. And every person who saw the footage described the same thing. It didn't feel like entertainment. It felt holy. Years later, after both men were gone, the recording was finally released publicly. And the world reacted exactly the way Johnny predicted. People didn't remember the imperfections. They remembered the truth. They remembered Elvis' shaking voice, Johnny's tears, June's embrace, the silence of 8,000 people too emotionally overwhelmed to clap. Music historians called it one of the greatest live performances ever recorded. Not because it was technically perfect, because it was painfully real. Today, students in music schools still study that performance. Not to learn vocal control, not to learn stage presence, but to learn courage. Because that night taught something rare. The most powerful thing an artist can do is stop hiding. And maybe that's why the moment still hurts people decades later. Because deep down, everyone understands the real meaning behind Johnny Cash's dare. It was never about singing gospel. It was about asking another broken man one terrifying question. Are you brave enough to let the world see who you really are? And for one unforgettable night in Nashville, Elvis Presley finally said yes.